begin.
Professor Bowens, welcome.
Thank you.
My pleasure. We have a doubt. Your first name is Michael.
Yes, that's right. Yes, Michael.
Michael, okay.
Michael. And then Bowens, is this it? How I should pronounce it?
That's correct, yeah. Michael Bowens.
Michael
Okay.
Bowens. Okay. So, sorry if it's not perfect. I will do my best.
It's perfect.
Okay. So, João Cortez is the chair of the session. The floor is yours, João.
So, welcome everyone. Good afternoon for those of you who are in Brazil. We are beginning the last day of the event, New Perspectives in Philosophy of Religion. And so in the first place, I would like, in the name of the organizers, to thank Professor Michael Bowens, who is going to give us a talk under the title, The Liar and the Saint, Reconsidering Anselm's Argument. Professor Michael Bowens works on social ontology, applied ethics, metaphysics, philosophical theology, and philosophy of economics. He started his philosophical studies at the University of Ghent, but then moved to the University of Leuven, where he obtained his PhD in 2018. Since 2019, he's a doctoral assistant at the University of Antwerp, where he teaches philosophy, and he's an affiliated researcher at the ETF Leuven. He's also an official contributor to the Austrian economics model and a member of the Center of Theology and Philosophy. So as usual, we will have a 50 minutes presentation followed by a debate, and those of you who are following us by YouTube can send messages with questions through the chat. Thank you again, Professor Bowens.
Thank you. I'll try to share my screen. Okay. Okay. I hope it's working. So first of all, good afternoon or good evening or good morning or how do you say it in Portuguese? Bom dia or something like that. My Portuguese is much worse than your pronunciation of my Dutch name. So thanks a lot to the organizers for hosting this wonderful conference and for enabling me to share some of my research. As a brief overview, I'll first give an introduction and some background, historical background. Then I'll treat Anselm, then Bonaventure, Bonaventure's interpretation of Anselm and his Augustinian background, and then treat with the liar and end with how I think the liar and the saint could have something to say to each other. I have introduction to simply to look at my title. I choose the verb reconsidering, which is a very modest verb because my aims are very modest. I don't plan to present a knockdown formulation of the argument. I want to look at how we've been looking at Anselm, or how we could look at Anselm's argument, so that it brings to light a connection, a similarity with the liar that might not have been noted before. I chose Anselm's argument, even though it's usually known as Anselm's ontological proof, but that's of course a misnomer. The word ontology didn't even exist in the 11th century. Argument might sound less stringent than proof. An ontological proof sounds stronger than an argument, than Anselm's argument, but I think that's not necessarily the case. I think that a proof often, perhaps even only, works given a certain system, given a certain background of assumptions that you're accepting, and within that system or set of assumptions, you can formulate a clear proof. And in that sense, most interesting philosophical arguments are arguments and not proofs, because you can, of course, argue about the question whether a proof is possible, whether proof is necessary, and that's something you can have an argument about, not the other way around. Whereas an argument is a much broader notion. You can't really reasonably question whether you need an argument at all, unless of course you're stepping outside the boundaries of philosophy at all. It's about Anselm, and Anselm is of course a saint being referred to, and I think it might not be completely irrelevant that he is a saint, or at least in the sense that he was a Benedictine monk who spent much of his life praying to God or about the God that he proved or tried to prove. We normally accept that assessing a sophisticated argument in any field of inquiry requires a reasonable amount of study, of becoming acquainted with that field of inquiry. So I think it's at least worth considering that if you want to seriously assess an argument for the existence of God, you need to become acquainted with the domain of inquiry that this argument refers to. And the least you could say is that Anselm devoted his life to the field of inquiry on which he developed his argument. Last point, the liar refers, of course, to the liar paradox, but I put Pinocchio up there because he's probably the culturally most famous liar that I could easily find a picture of. There's of course a version of the liar paradox that involves Pinocchio saying my nose is growing, but that's not the version I'll be looking into. So what is my proposal? I think there is a structural similarity between Anselm's arguments in Proslogion 2, chapter 2, and the liar paradox, whereby the liar paradox is expressing, and I'm inventing terminology, is expressing the negative side, and Anselm's argument the positive side of the same transcendental dynamic. What do I mean by a structural similarity? Well, something very, very modest, perhaps even deliberately vague. There's something similar going on there. Whether we can fully formalize the similarity is currently not my concern. I think there's a structural similarity in the sense that they both rely on, well, what I called here a transcendental dynamic. I mean, dynamic in the sense that there's a movement going on. In the case of the liar, it's easy to spot the movement going on that we can't seem to attain at a stable assessment of the truth value of the liar paradox. And I think that the same kind of dynamic, the same kind of movement is going on in the case of Anselm's argument, even though it goes in the opposite direction, which is why I called the one the negative side, and the positive side, the same transcendental dynamic. Transcendental might sound like having to do with an idealist philosophy, standardly German idealism. It's partly what I mean. It's partly also not what I mean. It is what I mean in the sense that I think it pertains to the enabling conditions of thinking in general. It's not what I mean in the sense that the realist tradition I'm referring to, with the scholastics I'm using here, were of course not idealists in that sense, but the transcendentals in their understanding of the term do play an important role in what I'm exploring here, and so in that sense I think there's a connection can be, or I'll try to draw a connection between their notion of the transcendentals and what idealism refers to as transcendental, referring to the enabling conditions of our thinking. So that's the basic proposal. My method, philosophers don't often talk about method, but I'll be using what Daniel Dennett called the method of the sculptor. He introduced, well, he only briefly mentions this method at the beginning of his book Elbow Room. It's his book on the problem of free will, and he proposed this method because he claims that a lot of discussions of the free will problem, and I think a fortiori for the problem of arguing for God's existence suffer from premature formalization, that philosophers too quickly want to attain very precise, even formalized arguments, but in doing so, they risk to miss the shape of the main topic. So he says what the method of the sculptor then amounts to is first you rough out the block of the philosophical problem, standing back and squinting now and then to make sure you're closing in on dimly seen final product. Only after the piece is built out in the right proportions do you return to each crude rough surface and invest great labor in getting the fine details just so. Some philosophers are very unsympathetic to this method when they encounter it in philosophy. They have no patience with roughed-in solutions and want to see nothing but hard, clean edges from the outset. And especially in analytic philosophy, I think he's thinking about that some people might be unsympathetic to this method. I think he's quite right that there's a real risk of premature formalization and thereby failing to touch upon the real philosophical issues, and even more so for the problem of free will. I think it holds for arguments on God's existence. Second methodological note, and this is from Saint Bonaventure. The arguments he's adducing for the existence of God are, in his opinion, more exercises of the intellect rather than proofs that provide evidence and make the truth manifest as proven. So the kind of argument that he thinks can be reached in arguing for the existence of God is an argument that corrects a lack of understanding, a faulty reflection, as he says here, on our part, and not something that lacks any evidence inherently. The truth that ultimately is God himself doesn't need any external arguments to give it further grounding or further certainty. So what arguments for existence of God can do is correct this faulty reflection on our part. They are exercises for our mind so that we can restore the original imago Dei in our mind, by which we are able to directly perceive the truth of the existence of God. Okay. For some, the historical background of the authors I'll be using here is, of course, Plato. For Augustine and for Anselm, the Platonist metaphysics and epistemology, especially in the case of Augustine's Illuminationism, is very clear and I think crucial for a correct assessment of what Anselm is doing. And in in Plato's Republic, Book 6, you have the famous analogy of the sun, whereby it says that the sun not only furnishes to visibles the power of visibility, but also provides for their generation and growth. So this is in the first part of the analogy. The sun as the classical analogy for that which gives the light of understanding does, according to Plato, not only give visibility, not only gives the light of understanding, but is also the source for their generation and growth, for their very being. So in the more formal part of the analogy, hence, the objects of knowledge not only receive from the presence of the good their being known, but their very existence and essence is derived to them from it. So the good is a source not only of our knowledge, of our understanding of reality, but is the source of reality itself. So that's in Book 6 of the Republic, and in Book 7 you have the famous analogy of the cave, but it is the ground of the convertibility of the transcendentals for the medieval, and especially the convertibility of being and goodness. That was a standard metaphysical position that is crucial in assessing Anselm's arguments. Second important historical background, St. Augustine, especially for St. Anselm. And Augustine clearly and repeatedly acknowledged the influence of the Platonists for his conversion in the Confessions. Repeatedly stresses that the books of the Platonists really helped him in his in the philosophical preparation of his conversion. This is a famous quote from the Confessions, Book 7, and it's interesting to compare this quote to Plato's point that we just saw in the Republic. I entered and beheld with the eye of my soul, such as it was, above the same eye of my soul, above my mind, the light unchangeable. Again, the classic analogy of the light as a source of all truth and all understanding. Nor was it above my soul as oil is above water, nor yet as heaven above earth, but above my soul because it made me, and I below it because I was made by it. If you compare this point to the previous quote by Plato that we just saw, if the sun is a source not only of all of our understanding, but also the source of all being, it is also the source of our Augustine's being. You could say that Augustine discovered there the personal implications, not just of discovering that the sun, Plato's sun, brings forth all that is, but that this light unchangeable is bringing forth Augustine at every single moment of time, and that is this personal encounter is what distinguishes Augustine's religious conversion from the purely philosophical discovery of Plato. So because above my soul, because it made me, and I below it because I was made by it. He that knows the truth knows what that light is, and he that knows eternity. Love knoweth it, O truth, who art eternity, and love who art truth, and eternity who art love. Thou art my God, to thee do I cite night and day. Okay, let's look at Anselm. And I'll start not with his proslogion, but with his monologion. As you probably all know, this proslogion is actually it's an appendix. It's an afterthought to the monologion that he wrote earlier at the request of his brothers at the Beck Monastery. And the proslogion tries to formulate in one argument what the monologion argues for with many arguments. And the crucial argumentation happens in Monologion chapter 1, but here in Monologion chapter 2, he summarizes what he has arrived at in Monologion 1, and it clearly reflects Platonist metaphysics, whereby all that is good participates in the supreme good. Quote, we have found then that there is something supremely good, because all good things are good through some one thing, namely that which is good through itself. That's what summarizes the argument in Monologion chapter 1. Say they look at all good things that exist. They are either good through something else or good through themselves, and ultimately all of them are good through that which is good through itself. So all that is good through a highest supreme good that is good through itself. That's a classic Platonic move that he makes in a couple of paragraphs compared to Plato's large oeuvre. But in the same way, we arrive at the necessary conclusion that there is something supremely great, since whatsoever is great, and that's the notion he'll be using in the proslogion, the notion of greatness instead of goodness. Since whatsoever is great through some one thing, namely that which is great through itself. So he's establishing a clear parallel between goodness and greatness. In the proslogion, he'll mainly be using greatness and only once or twice, especially in chapter 5, be using goodness, but we can be absolutely safe that given what he has written in the monologion and given the relationship between the monologion and the proslogion, that we can substitute goodness for greatness. I do not mean great in terms of size, like some sort of body, but something which the greater it is, the better or more valuable it is, like wisdom. So again, we see the clear parallel between greatness and what is good, what is valuable. And it's already clear indication that the kind of counter-arguments that came from Gaunilo and that became important in the entire reception of Anselm's arguments, the counter-argument referring to the island, the perfect island, substantially misses the core point of the argument. It is not by any sort of plausibility evident that being an island is better than not being an island, unlike being wise is better than not being wise. So that kind of counter argument really misses the metaphysical framework on the basis of which Anselm is arguing. And since only that which is supremely good can be supremely great, it is necessary that there is something that is best and greatest, i.e. of everything that exists, that is actually in Latin, that exists, supreme. So it's establishing two parallel orders here, the order of goodness, the order of greatness, and saying that they both run parallel and they end at the same point. And in Monologion 3, he adds the order of being to it, if you want. Therefore, not only are all good things such through something that is one and the same, and all great things such through something that is one and the same, namely goodness itself and greatness itself, but whatever is apparently exists, and I put the exclamation mark there because almost all English translations that I've encountered translate the Latin verb esse with the English word to exist, the English verb to exist, even though, well, existere exists in Latin, but Anselm uses it in the Proslogion only 3 times. So I've always wondered why these translations automatically revert to the verb to exist, because I think that there are important, subtle, but in this kind of context, very important differences between existence and being when we're talking about God. Apparently exist, or strictly speaking in Latin, apparently are through something that is one and the same. For everything that is, and I've replaced the Dean, in the Dean translation I'm using here, I've replaced the occurrences of exist with is. Everything that is either through something or through nothing, but nothing is through nothing. Nothing exists through nothing. For it is altogether inconceivable that anything should not exist by virtue of something. Whatever is then is not except through something, except if you're using explicitly Platonist language, whatever is then is not except by participating in something else, in something which is that thing in its pure form. Since then all things that are exist through this one being, doubtless this one being exists through itself. Whatever things are else then exist through something other than themselves, and this alone through itself. But whatever exists through another is less than that through which all things are, and which alone exists through itself. So the order of greater and less great is here used parallel with the notion of existing through itself. That which exists through itself is greater than that which does not exist through itself. Therefore, that which exists through itself exists in the greatest degree of all things. Important to understand when looking at Proslogion later, that greater than which nothing can be thought of. There is then some one being which alone exists in the greatest and the highest degree of all, but that which is greatest of all, and through which exists whatever is good or great, and in short, whatever has any existence, so the clear parallel between the order of goodness and greatness and being, that must be supremely good and supremely great and highest of all existing beings. That is what he is referring to in his Proslogion, with that greater than which nothing can be thought of. So if you then turn to his Proslogion, truly there is a God, although full as Satan's heart, there is no God. The classical formulation, we believe that thou art the being than which nothing greater can be thought of. And then at the very bottom here of the quote, I won't read entirely, the important sentence, it is one thing to be in understanding and in order to understand that it is the case, I've translated here. In Latin, it says alut enim est rem esse intellectum, alut intelligere rem esse. It is standardly translated as it is one thing for something to exist in the understanding in order to understand that it exists in reality. But of course, the Latin word res can be translated in very many ways. So I think a case can be made for translating it this way, which immediately gives a different sense to the argument. It is one thing for a case, for something in the broadest sense to be in the understanding, and in order to understand that it is the case. And then he gives that, which I've put in italics here, the analogy with the painter and the painting. And in his discussion with Gonilo afterwards, he sort of admits that it wasn't the best kind of analogy. He probably gets it from the Monologion, where he also uses a similar analogy. But he explicitly says to Gonilo, don't take this analogy too seriously. Because of course it gives the impression of an object existing in reality, in spatio-temporal reality, which is not really suited as an analogy for thinking about God as the metaphysical entity that he was referring to. Hence, even a fool is convinced that something than which nothing greater can be thought of is at least in the understanding. For when he hears of it, this he understands it, and whatever is understood is in the understanding. And assuredly that than which nothing greater can be thought of cannot be in understanding alone. For suppose it is in understanding alone, then it can be thought of to also be in reality, which is greater. Final part, therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be thought of is in understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be thought of is one than which greater can be thought of, but obviously this is impossible. Hence, and here he is for the first time using in Latin the verb existere, existit ergo procul dubio aliquid quo maius cogitare non valet et intellectu et in re. But again, there are different translations possible of existit. I'll go here with the classical translation, but perhaps there are other ones that would be better. Hence, there exists beyond doubt a being than which nothing great can be thought of, both in the understanding and in reality. That's the classical argument in chapter 2. A lot of people have said that the argument presented in chapter 3 is actually stronger or more important. I think that for a general appreciation of what he's up to, chapter 5 is even more important, where he says, God is whatever it is better to be than not to be, and he, as the only self-existent being, creates all things from nothing. He repeats the point that we had seen from the Monologion, where he briefly brings us together again. What art thou except that which, as the highest of all alone exists to itself and creates all other things from nothing. So that which alone exists to itself, and on the basis of which all other things are, because they participate in that supreme goodness or greatness or being that this thing is. But this can, for whatever is not this is less than what can be thought of, but this cannot be thought of thee. What good therefore does the supreme good lack, through which every good is? Therefore thou art just and truthful and blessed, and whatever it is better to be than not to be. Hence wisdom and goodness and justice and mercy, all what Anselm called pure perfections, all these pure perfections belong to God, pertain to God. For it is better to be just than not just, better to be blessed than not blessed. So many interpretations of Anselm's argument focus on the can be thought part of his argument, and then subsequently accuse him of illegitimately jumping from the order of intelligibility to the order of being. I think, however, that the argument explicitly, especially in the Monologion, and is briefly alluded to in chapter 5 of the Proslogion, relies on a parallel order between truth, goodness, and being, and that which Anselm is referring to, namely that greater than which nothing can be thought, is referring to the keystone of these distinct but parallel orders that ultimately culminate in the same thing, in the same entity, in the same being, namely that supreme being he's referring to. So instead of an illegitimate jump from one order to the other order, he is referring from within the one order, the order of intelligibility, if you want to call it like that. He's referring to that keystone, which is the same keystone for the order of intelligibility and the order of being and the order of goodness. Hence, it is indeed something that exists in reality as well. Otherwise, it would not be that greater than which nothing can be thought. It would not be the keystone of these different distinct parallel orders that he is explicitly relying on and establishing in a monologion and referring to in proslogion 5. Okay, I'll switch now to Bonaventure because it's he, I think, that starts to make the connection with the lyre explicit. This is from Disputed Questions on the Trinity, and the first article, the first question is on whether the existence of God is indubitable. The rest of the book is on the Trinity, so it's only the very first article and the very first question that deals with the existence of God. He uses 3 series of arguments, and then this is the beginning of the 3rd series of arguments, which all belong to this kind of argument whereby every truth which is so certain that it cannot be thought not to be is indubitably true, but the existence of God is such a truth, and therefore the existence of God is indubitable. The first premise is self-evident, the second can be shown in a number of ways, and then he goes on to list a couple of arguments by Anselm and a couple of arguments by Augustine that we look at, and that clearly show this Platonist tradition these authors are standing in. He starts with a reference to Anselm's proslogion. Good Lord, I give you thanks, because that which I first believed through your gift, I now understand through your illumination, so that even if I did not wish to believe in your existence, I could not fail to understand its truth. So apart from the metaphysical parallels I had been stressing before, here we see the clear epistemological import of Augustinianism or of Augustine's Platonism, the light that Anselm or Bonaventure receive, by which they understand that God exists, is the divine light itself. So that is also in line with the methodological point I referenced earlier, whereby Bonaventure says that these arguments are an exercise of the mind, because that of which we are trying to establish the existence is that which gives the very foundation for all our knowledge. Next reference to Anselm. Anselm proves the same thing in the following way. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, but since it is true that that which cannot be thought not to be is more true than that which can be thought not to be, therefore, if God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, God cannot be thought not to be. And it's only in the next paragraph, which I've replaced here with the 3 dots, that he uses Anselm's classical formulation of the argument. But he starts by noting again this parallel between the order of greatness that Anselm is explicitly referring to and the order of truth that he is relying on. It is true that that which cannot be thought not to be is more true than that which can be thought not to be. So what Anselm is implicitly relying on in Bonaventure's interpretation of Anselm is the parallel between that which can be thought of and which can not be thought of, and the order of truth. It is ultimately truth that is being aimed at in trying to develop an argument about what can and cannot be thought. So the most English translations use the verb to conceive, what can be conceived, but there again, in the Latin verb is cogitare, which, as Anselm explains in chapter 4 of the Proslogion, can, I think, best be translated as being thought of. It's a very generic verb by which he means to think about anything. Next reference to Anselm. Anselm writes, "You alone are whatever is better to be than not to be." So that's reference to chapter 5 of the Proslogion. But every indubitable truth is better than doubtful truth. Therefore, being is to be attributed to God indubitably rather than doubtfully. So again, the link to the order of truth that Anselm is relying on in the interpretation of Bonaventure. He then refers to Augustine's Soliloquies, written briefly after his conversion, and which refer even more explicitly to the notion of truth. Augustine writes in his Soliloquies that no truth can be seen except through the first truth, the highest truth, that truth greater than which nothing can be thought of, if you want. And we'll see in Augustine's De Libero Arbitrio that Augustine almost explicitly uses that phrasing. But that truth through which every truth is seen is the most indubitable truth. And so think again about the phrasings Anselm used in Monologion, that goodness through which everything is good, that greatness through which everything is great, and that being through which everything that is. And here Bonaventure is listening Augustine's phrasing, referring to the order of truth instead of the other transcendental orders. Therefore, the existence of God is not only an indubitable truth, but it is impossible to think of something more indubitable. It is therefore a truth of such a sort that it cannot be thought not to be. So the reason why it cannot be thought not to be is because it is true. That is the ultimate standard, not our ability to conceive of it or not. Again, he proves the same thing as follows, and this becomes a crucial link to the liar paradox. Whatever can be thought of can be stated, but it is no way possible to say that God does not exist without saying simultaneously that God does exist. This becomes clear in the following way. If there is no truth, then it is true to say there is no truth. But if this is true, then something is true. And if something is true, there is a first truth. Therefore, if it is not possible to say that God does not exist, neither is it possible to think it. So let's have a brief look at what Augustine is saying on the free choice of the will. Not because that's what is being explicitly referenced to, because that's again to the Soliloquies, but in book 2 of Augustine's The Free Choice of the Will, he has a discussion and dialogue with Evodius, whereby he tries to establish the existence of God, and says, or let's say Evodius say, even if I could find something better than what is best in my nature, I would not immediately say it was God. I don't call God that to which my reason is inferior, but that to which none is superior, that greater than which nothing can be thought. I won't read all the rest because time is moving on. But he basically makes a classic Platonic move. If our reason can see something eternal and unchangeable, then that must be God. And he ends that discussion. It's a long part. I'm skipping, but he ends it with, consequently, if the truth is neither, so truth itself, if truth itself is neither inferior nor equal, it follows that it's superior and more excellent than our mind. Now, I had promised you, if you recall, that I would show you that there's something more exaltant than our mind and reason. Here you have it, the truth itself. So Augustine, starting from this notion that he wanted to show Evodius something greater than which nothing can be thought of, ends with truth itself. Now, Bonaventure then deals with a counter-argument to this last point, the argument from truth, and he replies to that argument by distinguishing between two affirmations that are made in any affirmation. And it has been understood that an affirmative proposition contains two affirmations, one by which the predicate is affirmed of the subject, and another by which the proposition itself is affirmed as true. In terms of the first affirmation, such a proposition is distinguished from a negative proposition, which denies the predicate of a subject. The second affirmation is similar to a negative proposition, which denies the predicate of the subject. The second affirmation is similar to a negative proposition because both the negative and the positive proposition assert that something is true. For just as every evil presupposes a good, so every falsehood implies a truth. Therefore, the error which affirms that there is no truth includes both parts of a contradiction, since by negating the predicate of the subject, it denies any truth whatsoever. But by asserting that it is true, it posits the existence of some truth. Therefore, in view of both of these affirmations, it can be inferred that this is intrinsically false and unintelligible to any mind that apprehends correctly. So, in defending that claim that God indubitably exists, and we can derive it from the existence of truth itself, because denial of truth implies the assertion of truth, Bonaventure makes clear that apart from what the explicit assertion that there is no truth, that same assertion implicitly asserts that there is some truth because it claims of itself that it is true. This eventually became one of the ways that some medievals tried to solve the liar paradox. So this is from John Burden. Some people have said, and so it seemed to me elsewhere, that although this proposition, every proposition is false, does not signify or assert anything according to the signification of its terms, other than that every proposition is false. Nevertheless, every proposition by its form signifies or asserts itself to be true. Therefore, every proposition, like the liar, asserting itself to be false, either directly or implicitly, implicitly in the case of every proposition is false, which is an implicit case of stating of itself that it is false, for although things are as it signifies, insofar as it signifies itself to be false, nevertheless things are not as it signifies, insofar as it signifies itself to be true. Therefore it is false and not true, since for its truth it is required not only that things should be as it signifies, but also that it should be in whatever way it signifies them to be. So several medievals took up this solution, but it's a solution that appeared throughout the history of philosophy. I've chosen this quote from a Swiss 20th century mathematician, Paul Finsler, who defended the same solution to the liar, namely, every statement whatsoever is asserting its own truth. Quote, the right solution to the liar paradox arises from the observation that one has to pay attention not just to the formal expression, but to the real meaning of an assertion. But every assertion has a sense that that which is asserted is supposed to be true. However, if at the same time it is asserted that precisely this is false, which the liar does, then two opposing statements are asserted, and this together results in a false assertion. So that's the way that he, in this long line of thinkers, solved the liar paradox. So this sentence is false. The liar paradox contradicts its own embeddedness in, that's again a bit vague terminology, its own embeddedness in and indebtedness to truth. And the paradox only arises when this embeddedness is not recognized, because if you recognize it, you see that it's not a paradox, but a simple contradiction. And Finsler notes that the main source for why paradoxes arise is that the implicit assertions that are really there are overlooked or not taken into account. And this danger is even greater in the case of a purely formal treatment. And Finsler was sort of a card-carrying Platonist who was very skeptical towards purely formal approaches to mathematics, and always stress that the real meaning of what is said is not solely in these formal expressions. And just as an aside, Frege's famous quote here: "It is worthy of notice that the sentence 'I smell the scent of violets' has the same contents as the sentence 'It is true that I smell the scent of violence.'" You can interpret it in this deflationary sense. It seems then that nothing is added to the thought by my ascribing to the property of truth. But if you're accepting that solution to the liar paradox, it simply follows that Frege is making explicit there what is always implicitly asserted with every assertion. So every assertion A in an object language instantiates an implicit assertion A accent in a meta language whereby the truth of A is implicitly asserted. Then we have Tarski on language hierarchies. You could advocate a rigid stratification of these language hierarchies to avoid this kind of paradoxes, but that's not necessary as long as the transcendental role, the embeddedness of the transcendence of truth is recognized. Transcendence of truth in the sense that it is always instantiating a meta language on the basis of which the object language is talked about or thought about. And the liar paradox dialect tries to deny this very embeddedness. Anselm's argument, on the other hand, points to the summit of that hierarchy, truth itself, as being convertible with being and goodness and greatness. Hence its negative form, nothing greater than, whereby it blocks the instantiation of a meta level because it always automatically refers to the highest level. It can therefore also not be judged as not being the case, not being true, since such judgment is only possible from a meta level, and Anselm's formulation automatically refers to the highest level, or that level higher than which nothing can be thought of. By directly pointing to the infinite transcendence and convertibility of truth, the argument obtains a transcendental position vis-a-vis existing in the mind and existing in reality, which is a dualism the argument surpasses. Conclusion, I think I'm just in time. The paradoxical character of the liar arises when the transcendental role of the transcendence of truth, lots of transcendence going on here, is explicitly denied, whereas Anselm's argument explicitly relies on the transcendental role of the transcendence of truth, such that it reveals the very ground and summit of all our knowing and thinking in the classical Platonist tradition that he and Augustine were heirs to, hence its indubitable and a priori character. Thank you for your attention and patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Bowens, for this stimulating talk. And so we have some time now for questions. If anyone wants to talk, should raise his hand, please, or instead send a question by chat. I can perhaps begin with a question. You said
Sure.
that ontological is perhaps not a proper name for Anselm's arguments, but I would like to ask, what would be a proper name in the scholastic sense for the domain of these arguments? So would it be a metaphysical argument or perhaps an argument about being? Because you talked about the transcendentals and about the interconnection between the orders of being, truth, and goodness, but we see a prevalence of the question of being in the argument, I think, right? What is the status of this prevalence of being in comparison to truth and goodness? How would you name the domain of the argument? Is the domain of metaphysics or is a question of being? How would you name it?
Thank you, that's a good question. An easy answer would be, well, this is the domain of this kind of arguments in natural theology, but that's of course not an answer to the question you're asking. I think that it doesn't belong to any domain. Of course, I mean the transcendentals themselves well, they transcend the Aristotelian categories. But I think that Anselm's argument, in its very attempt to point to the very origin of all our knowing and of all being, trying to say that it fits within a certain domain. I would be hesitant to really say, well, it's this or that domain. I mean, you can approach it, especially if you read the Monologion, at least the first couple of chapters of the Monologion, because the rest of the Monologion is on the Trinity, not on the existence of God. But it's clearly it's a metaphysical road that Anselm is taking. In the Proslogion, it's less of a metaphysical road, and the reason he came up with this formula there of what can be thought, has led, I think, many interpreters to a less metaphysical interpretation than should be given to the Proslogion in connection with the Monologion. So yes, metaphysics would be the best starting point to assess the nature of the argument, even though I'm not fully confident that is the last or the full categorization we could give to it.
Great, thank you. Any question? Do anyone want to raise a question? Yes, Ricardo.
Thank you, Professor Michael, for your amazing talking and clear talking. It's not clear for me the relation between the domain of the thought and the being in this case of the Anselmo's argument from your point of view. Can you clear more this for me?
Okay, so if I understand your question, what is your question? What relationship is between the domain of being, metaphysically understood, and Anselm's argument?
And the domain of thought.
And the domain of thought, yeah, okay. Thank you, I understand it. Well, the crucial assumption that Anselm is making is, of course, that these two domains refer to the same or are parallel in the classical realist sense, that that which we can think about, that which we can thoughtfully discover, find out, is that which is real. The standard realist parallel between the order of thinking, what can be thought, and the order of being, which is why I gave the Plato's quote at the very beginning of my talk, where the idea of the good is what ultimately guarantees the parallel between the order of intelligibility, the order of what can be thought, and the order of being, because they both stem from the same source, the idea of the good. And of course, the idea of the good comes, metaphysically speaking, very, very close to the Christian notion of God as the source of all being and of all intelligibility. So in that sense, yeah, that is. Well, is it presupposed by Anselm? It's certainly something that, for a lot of modern authors who take more of an idealist position, it's far less evident, and that's one of the reasons why I changed the translation of cogitare from conceiving to thinking of, because of course we can conceive a lot of things. In the sense of we can imagine the world to be in very many different ways. But when Anselm speaks about thinking, and he makes it clear in chapter 4 of the Proslogion, the very nature of thinking is to discover the structure of being itself. So in that sense, that's a crucial parallel, crucial assumption that Anselm is indeed making, in line with that Platonist tradition, and in line with, of course, the all of Christian theology, which holds that all of reality is inherently logical. If you look at the prologue of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. It used the Greek word logos, serving as a clear interface with the Greek tradition, which refers to the logos as a source of intelligibility of all being, and where the Christian tradition says, yes, that source of intelligibility of all of being is the second person of the Trinity. So there we have both a philosophical Platonist argument and a theological argument for the comfortability, or at least the parallel between the order of intelligibility and the order of being.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I think Professor Persp has a question.
Yeah, so I thought the stuff on Anselm was really interesting, but my question is more on that medieval solution to the lyre. So have you thought, or have they thought about whether this works for things like a two-sentence lyre, where the first sentence says, the second sentence is true, and the second sentence says the first sentence is false? Can one still use the same solution?
There, I must admit that I don't know. I haven't. Well, there's lots of literature you undoubtedly know about the medieval lyres, but I've really only looked at this specific solution, and I haven't studied their solutions to the lyre in more sophisticated versions. So I can't give you an answer. Stephen Reed has published lots on the medieval lyres, so he might be the person to go to see if their solution holds there as well. And by the way, at least some medievals changed their mind on this particular solution to the lyre, so that might also be something to take into consideration. Even though, as far as I know, they were less adamant about the Platonic background to this solution that Bonaventure was clearly aware of, and they treated it more in a semantic and a logical fashion, rather than in the purely metaphysical domain that Bonaventure was treating it. I can't give you further details.
Yes, I will read a last question from Fabio Bertato. Could you please elaborate a little more on the consideration of infinite transcendence of truths and the transcendental position vis-a-vis existing in the mind and existing in reality, and the block of the instantiation of a meta level?
Okay, thanks for that question. Well, the basic meaning of transcendence, of course, is to go above, to obtain a position, or to stand at a position that is higher than the other position. And in that sense, by the transcendence of truth, I mean that our consideration of the truth of something, of whatever is said or thought or argued or whatever, immediately poses us at a higher position than that which is claimed or argued in favor for or against, in line with what Bonaventure is saying there explicitly. We are always implicitly making a truth claim on, in my interpretation, a meta level relative to the explicit assertion. that means that if Anselm's argument succeeds in pointing to not a specific meta level, but to the very source out of which this infinite series of meta levels can originate, namely truth itself, which can never be captured in a statement, in a theory, in a thought, in an argument, whatever, but always transcends any particular theory of statement or argument or whatever. By directly pointing towards it, of course you can't grasp it, but he can point towards it by saying it is that which nothing greater can be thought. So any attempt, and it's also in the brief quote from Augustine's free choice of the will, which I skipped. As one of my children. The brief line of Augustine, which I skipped, where he says that, look, if you are trying to come up with something higher, that is what God would be. So, in that negative formulation of Anselm, we are making sure that we can never be trumped, that we can never reach a higher position. So that is how you block the instantiation of a meta level, by saying that, look, we're always referring to whatever higher meta level you can come up with, because we are referring to the source of that transcendence itself. So any question we could raise about whether it exists only in the mind, or whether it exists also in reality, as the classic interpretation of Anselm's argument in Proslogion 2 goes, well, that is an argument that any argument trying to think about this distinction about existing in the mind or existing in reality is something to which a truthful answer can be given, is something about which one can think and one can argue. So it is presupposing this meta level from which this very discussion, this very question can be approached, can be thought about, can be argued for or against. And in that sense, that which Anselm is referring to in his argument is the meta level from which that very distinction between existing in the mind and existing in reality can überhaupt, can at all, that would be the best English translation, but überhaupt is beautiful German word, can at all be thought about, can at all be argued for or against. And in that sense, I think that the argument refers to the transcendental position vis-a-vis the very distinction between existing in the mind or existing in reality.
Great. I would like to thank you again, Professor Bauwens, for your talk and for the answers to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the organization again.
So I would like to welcome our next speaker, Professor Joshua Rasmussen. I'm not sure, am I pronounced it well?
That's perfect. Yes. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So Professor Joshua Rasmussen from Azusa Pacific University will present us a talk under the title, Does Atheism Entail a Contradiction? Professor Rasmussen is an associate professor of philosophy, and his area of expertise is analytic metaphysics, with a focus on basic categories of reality, such as objects, ideas, and necessary existence. He is the author of several books, including Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, Necessary Existence with Alexander Persp, How Reason Can Lead to God, and Is God the Best Explanation of Things with Philippe Leon. He's also the founder of the Worldview Design YouTube channel. So thank you again, Professor Rasmussen, for, in the name of the organizing, I would like to thank you for your presence and your availability. Are you going to present? Yes, perfect. We see it.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for hosting this. And it's good to be with you guys. I've never done a conference online like this before. And I was just thinking it's kind of special to be able to give a talk to another country from my own living room from California. So hopefully this will turn out well. So you guys can see the PowerPoint. Is it full screen or do I need?
It is not full screen.
Okay, hold on. Let's see. There we go.
No,
okay.
Okay, great.
You guys got it. So my question is, does atheism entail a contradiction? And my goal here is not to analyze atheists. I'm not interested in whether atheists are rational or not rational or have contradictions in their own mind. I assume atheists are rational. My question is about atheism, the hypothesis that there is no God. And I want to think about the relationship between this hypothesis and logic itself. So my main purpose is to explore the prospect of a new pathway from pure reason to theism. So in the picture here, I have a pathway labeled ontological arguments. These arguments are associated with purely reason-based arguments a priori. And yet I've found some other kinds of arguments that I don't know if they would really neatly fit under the classification of ontological argument, unless you just define an ontological argument as a reason-based path. But there are some other paths that are based on some of my own work, and I want to explore the prospect of another strategy. So the nature of the path. First, as I said, it's not an ontological argument, at least in this sense. I'm not going to try to tease out a contradiction from the concept of God as being the greatest being. So I'm not going to try to argue that, well, God is so great, therefore, because he's so great, his greatness implies certain things about his existence. But instead, I'm going to think about some conditions of truth. In particular, if atheism is true, so the proposition that no God exists, if that is true, then what does that entail? Could that in some way entail a contradiction? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to point to two different paths within a general strategy. So I'm going to open up the secret path. I'm going to get past a certain obstacle to it, open it up, and then I'm going to explore two different pathways. So what is at stake? Why I care about this topic? Well, there are a few things, three things I want to just point to that interest me with respect to this topic. First, if atheism does entail a contradiction, well, then God has a super sturdy grip on existence. You might think that God has the greatest conceivable grip on existence because God's existence is a matter of logical necessity. I ask this question, could a perfect being have the strongest conceivable grip on existence? And is the strongest conceivable grip on existence logical, necessary existence? You might actually think that this question could be turned around into an argument against a perfect being. So here I introduce the weak existence argument against a perfect being. Premise one, a perfect being would have the strongest conceivable grip on existence because, well, let me say a little more to motivate this, because it's so great, its greatness would span all possible worlds and all logically possible worlds. If it didn't span all the logically possible worlds, then it would have some kind of limit to its greatness. So you might think its greatness would have to span all the worlds if it's a perfect being. But then you might think, well, atheism doesn't entail contradiction. The strongest conceivable grip on existence would have to be logically necessary existence. Okay, so the next point is that nothing can have logical necessary existence. And if these things are all true, then it follows that a perfect being cannot exist. Now, you might question that second premise. You might think, look, God could have the greatest conceivable grip on existence, and this might just be metaphysical necessary existence, and this doesn't have to include logical necessary existence. But that's a question, and this is an argument that one might think is at stake in this general inquiry. This is also related to some work by Richard Swinburne, as many of you may know, in his argument that God does not have the strongest grip on existence. He thinks the strongest grip on existence would be a kind of logical necessity, but that God can't have that. So This inquiry is going to be related to his argument, and I'm going to talk specifically about some steps in his argument shortly. Okay, what else is at stake? Well, if atheism entails a contradiction, then that opens up an idea about God's relationship to logic. For example, you might think that God's mind grounds logical necessities, and therefore God's mind is as necessary as the logical necessities themselves. And then third, I think this is interesting because if atheism entails contradiction, then, well, there would be a new path through reason to theism. Well, it may not be new. Maybe there are other a priori paths that work, but I'm going to try to explore a new way of putting some things together. So this is related to the general question, is it possible to see that God is real just by reason alone? Okay. Now, there's a major obstacle to this kind of a path. I'm calling it the secret path, I guess, because it's sort of not a mainline path, although it's going to use some elements from things that may be familiar to you. It's kind of a way of putting things together. But the obstacle is that you really can't go this place, because to say that atheism entails a contradiction, well, that's to go too far. I mean, that's kind of an insult to atheists, you might think. You might think, like, I mean, surely it's at least logically coherent to think that there's no God. You know, surely atheists aren't making this kind of a mistake of thinking that something that's actually a contradiction is actually true. You know, that's going too far. And there's some ways of drawing out this worry, and I'm going to draw out a few ways in a moment. So that's kind of a major obstacle. And you might think, if there's any chance of showing that God exists a priori, it's going to be through through one of the ontological argument paths. Many people think those arguments are a kind of logic trick. There are some interesting developments in recent literature that you might think are pretty interesting, but in the end, you might think that's the only place where you might be able to deduce that God exists a priori. The idea of another path where you just show that there's a contradiction, well, that can't be possible. Okay, so there's just this general worry, and I'll say more about this soon. So here's my big roadmap of where I'm going to go. First, I'm going to say a little bit more to clarify what it means for atheism to entail a contradiction. Then I'm going to seek to remove that obstacle and different forms of that obstacle. Then I'm going to mark a pathway from atheism to the existence of truth. So I'm going to argue that if atheism is true, then something is true. And then I'm going to give a conceptualist path from the existence of truth to the existence of theism. So you'll see how that goes. Then I'm going to give an existence path based on some of my work on modal cosmological arguments from the existence of something to the existence of God. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with some general take-home lessons. Okay, so let me just say a little bit more about what I mean when I consider the hypothesis that atheism entails a contradiction. First, by atheism, I mean what Michael Martin called strong atheism, which is the hypothesis that there is no God, as opposed to a kind of weak atheism, which is just the lack of belief in God. So I'm thinking of atheism as an actual proposition that says something, and it says that there is no God. Now, there's different ways of defining God, but I'm going to stipulate the following sufficient condition for the existence of God. I'm going to stipulate that if there is a necessarily existing mind, that mind will count as a God. And I'm going to just stipulate this by definition. So really my interest then is in whether the hypothesis that there is no necessarily existing mind entails some contradiction. Next, by entails a contradiction, what I mean is that it is possible to deduce a contradiction of the form A and not A by reason alone. Now I say by reason alone to point to this faculty by which you can see such things as 2 + 2 = 4. Nothing can be both true and not true at the same time. Nothing can be both green and not green at the same time. And I'm suggesting that there is a kind of faculty by which you just see these things. I want to offer here just a few further clarifications, because sometimes people associate entails contradiction with specific kinds of deductions in logic. And I think it's helpful to make just 4 different clarifications here. So first, I want to point out that the contradiction doesn't have to be an explicit contradiction of the form A and not A. It could be implicit. So in the case of 7 plus 5 equals 11, I claim that that's implicitly contradictory. It doesn't have the form of A and not A, but I claim that it is possible by reason to see principles of reason from which you can deduce that 7 plus 5 equals 12, and then that 11 is not 12, so that 7 plus 5 equals 11 actually entails the contradiction that 7 plus 5 does not equal 12, and with this principle of reason, 7 plus 5 equals 12. So here what I'm doing is I'm assuming that reason can reveal truths that are not seen just by your empirical senses through seeing or hearing or tasting. Maybe you need some of your empirical senses to comprehend, to actually read a sentence on a page, or to maybe even pick up some concepts to comprehend what's being stated. But then once you understand what's being stated, it's by reason that you can just see whether it's true or not. So it doesn't have to be explicit, it could be implicit. Related, there could be a contradiction that is not actually seen to be a contradiction. Maybe it takes some work to tease out the contradiction. Maybe nobody on earth has seen the contradiction. It doesn't follow that there isn't a contradiction. And that's important because I think sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, I don't see a contradiction, therefore it's not contradictory. Well, on this understanding of a contradiction, as long as there's some way of deducing a contradiction by some line of reason, it will count as contradictory. Also, contradiction could be controversial. So I use example of 7 plus 5 equals 11 there, because some mathematical fictionalists will say that all mathematical truths are false. And so they would say that 7 plus 5 equals 12 is not true, even though I would argue that it is possible to see by reason that 7 plus 5 equals 12. I don't claim that that's therefore uncontroversial, as it is controversial whether 7 plus 5 equals 12. And it sort of turns out that everything that anybody has ever proposed turns out to be controversial. There's always somebody who's not so sure of that. I mean, even logical inferences, even modus ponens, even the law of non-contradiction, all those things can be controversial. And I don't claim that the controversy is due to irrationality. People could be rational or irrational, but it could be that there's just many, many things to consider. And there are reasons you might think that provide a kind of barrier to seeing what you might see without that barrier in place. And that barrier might be well motivated by certain philosophical reflections. So I think that's also an important point here, because I'm really interested in just purely the relationship between theism and logic, and not whether we can sort of force people on the pain of irrationality to see that something is true. And then finally, a deduction need not be limited to some particular canon of truths that human beings have sort of agreed upon. I've come to think that the notion of analytic truth, I mean, there's different ways of analytic truth. I'm not happy with any of the definitions that I've seen. Ultimately, I think analytic truths just are truths that are deducible from some canon of truths that people, it's sort of so obvious to so many people that we've sort of said, okay, these are the truths, and if we can deduce it from those truths, then we'll call it analytic. But I'm going to leave open the prospect. I'm not going to put limits on what truths can be deduced. Just whatever you can see by reason, that will count as a contradiction. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so the obstacle to a contradiction. I'm going to address two worries. So first, there's just this general common worry that when we consider the proposition that there is no God, we don't really see a contradiction. Okay, we don't see any contradiction in that proposition. It doesn't have the form of a contradiction. Now, you can probably anticipate what I'm going to say here at this general level, just from the clarifications that I gave, which is that not seeing a contradiction is not the same as actually seeing that no contradiction could be deduced through some path of reason. So while we don't see a contradiction in a proposition, it does not follow that there's no way to derive a contradiction, perhaps through lines of reasoning that nobody has seen. I have a picture there of a pathway that goes out of sight. So maybe there's an entailment line that just goes out of sight. And so we want to be careful here not to make the mistake of inferring, I don't see how a contradiction could be deduced. So therefore, I see that there can't be a contradiction. It's not as if somebody has to show that atheism is contradictory in order for one to be moved off of the belief that atheism is not contradictory. For all that one need, all one really needs to not believe that atheism is contradictory is to see that one doesn't see one way or the other a contradiction. So it's a further question whether a contradiction can be deduced. So perhaps a chain of entailments follows a path outside of our sight. Now here's a second worry, and this gets a little more technical. This comes from Richard Swinburne's work on necessary existence. And I call this an existential worry because it's a worry from existence. So Richard says that a contradiction cannot be deduced from denying the existence of anything, whatever that thing is. At least this is the first iteration of what he says. We're going to look at a second iteration of what he says after I analyze this first iteration. So here's the existential argument. First, we have an existential premise, which says a negative existential of the form X doesn't exist can never entail a positive existential of the form X exists. Okay, I mean, that's kind of intuitive. It's not like removing rocks from reality is going to logically entail that there are rocks, that it seems like rocks could just be removed and there's nothing wrong with that. And what you say about rocks, you could say about anything. Planets, people, numbers, just saying that they don't exist doesn't entail that they do exist. Now, if atheism entails a contradiction, then a negative existential, namely God doesn't exist, would entail a positive existential, namely God exists. And so therefore atheism does not entail a contradiction. So now we've gone further from just not seeing a contradiction to arguing that, okay, there just is no contradiction based on the existential premise. So here's my reply. The existential premise is false. Here's why. I actually presented this argument to Richard Swinburne at a philosophy conference. We were keynotes at the American Philosophical Association talking about this very topic. And in that conversation with him, this was the argument that I gave him. So suppose there is no truth, then it is true that there is no truth. Therefore, if there is no truth, then there is a truth, namely that there is a truth. You could think of this as following from Tarski's T-schema, where P is true if and only if P. So if there is no truth, that's P, then it is true that there is no truth. Therefore, there is no truth entails there is a truth, and that's a contradiction. Therefore, negative existential, namely there is no truth, entails a positive existential, namely there is a truth. And so that contradicts the existential premise. So it's very interesting to me because when I presented this argument to Richard, his response was to revise the existential premise. And I don't know for sure if this was just a dialectical move or if he was convinced by the argument, but he revised the premise so that he focused on something more specific, concrete things. One version of this he gives in terms of substances, a bearer of properties that's not itself borne by other things. But I'm going to just put this in terms of concrete things, and the basic idea will be the same. So no negative existential about a concrete thing entails a positive existential about a concrete thing. That will be the revised existential premise. And then you can see why this would be relevant to the question of whether atheism entails contradiction, because look, if God exists, God is a concrete thing. We can think of a concrete thing minimally as something that has capacity to produce things. Okay, so God has capacity to produce things according to at least a classic conception of God. So God doesn't exist cannot entail that God exists if this existential premise is true, that a negative existential about a concrete thing cannot entail a positive existential about a concrete thing. So from all this, it follows that atheism just cannot entail a contradiction in principle. So you think of that orange cone that says, don't go down that path, because in principle, there's danger over there. You're going to run into problems. Here's my reply to the revised worry. I've got two thoughts. First, I'm wondering why think that the existential premise itself is true. Why I think that's true. Now, maybe there's a way of motivating it. I haven't seen that it's been established. But second, and more significantly, someone who is a concretist, who thinks that all things are concrete or grounded in something concrete, has independent reason to reject the revised existential premise. And this is interesting to me because on a dialectical level, as far as I understand, Richard Swinburne himself is a concretist, and he appeals to concretism in his motivation for his argument. In one of his papers on this, he talks about the prospect of there being abstract propositions, and he says if there are abstract propositions, then there might be entailment links between them that go beyond what the existential premise will allow, and yet he argues against the existence of these abstract propositions. So my understanding is that he would be a concretist, but whatever his view is, in any case, there are concretists. So let me just draw out why a concretism would cause a problem for this premise, and then the significance of that. So suppose there is no concrete thing, then it is true that there is no concrete thing. Therefore, there is a truth. Necessarily, if there is a truth, then there is something concrete by concretism. Therefore, there is no concrete thing entails that there is a concrete thing. And there you go. That's the contradiction. That shows that a negative existential about concrete things, that there are none, entails a positive existential about concrete things, that there are some. So therefore, that revised existential premise would not be true according to this argument. My point here is that the pathway, that existential premise is a controversial premise. And my goal is to open up this sort of curiosity or the possibility of exploring this pathway, to go past that orange cone and see what we might find over there. So I'm not convinced by the argument against any of the arguments I've seen against the possibility of deducing a contradiction. So that makes me curious. So maybe there's a way to deduce a contradiction. So my summary response is that while there may be an orange cone on this path, the light of reason has not illuminated a clear boundary. You know, it's like, look, there's space around that orange cone. You could walk around it. And a secret path, I mean, don't you just want to see what's over there? I mean, aren't you just curious? You know, secret. Well, let's go over there. Let's see what we might find. What's in that area? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first describe a kind of logical leg of the path, and then that's going to lead to a fork. And then I'm going to explore both forks. It's one fork, I guess, leads to two paths, right? So I'm going to explore both paths. Okay, so I think you can maybe anticipate the strategy here. So suppose there is no God, then the proposition that there is no God is true. Those angle brackets there are going to abbreviate the proposition that. And by the way, for neutrality, I'm not going to assume anything about the metaphysics of propositions. You can think of these as sentence tokens or as mental states or as abstract propositions. But I don't need that for this leg of the argument. So I just mean a truth bearer, something that is true. So there is no God is a truth bearer, it's true. Therefore, if there is no God, then there is a truth. The truth is that there is no God. Okay, so what I've done is I've tried to show an entailment from there is no God to there is a truth. And I just want to offer here a note on entailment, this kind of entailment. Because there's kind of a general worry that somebody might have, which is that you can't just by logic see that something exists. And what I've done here is I've used logic to try to tease out the existence of something, namely some truth, through an entailment, through a deduction. And you might think, well, that already is like the thing that people start worrying about. And I want to just suggest here is that seeing something by reason does not preclude seeing it by other means as well. So a few points on this. We can see by reason the inference from P is true to P exists, I think, because something can't be true unless it's there to be true. Meanwhile, we can also see that P exists is true directly by seeing P itself. So you might see P in your mind or on paper, whatever the nature of P is, you see it so you can verify its existence. You don't have, in other words, you don't have to see that it's true in order to see that it exists. In fact, You might not even be able to see that as true without seeing that it exists sort of like directly. But the point is that there's this other way that you can deduce its existence from its truth by just seeing the entailment link from truth to existence. So the fact that we can see that P exists directly does not preclude seeing by reason that P entails P is true, and also that P is true entails that P exists. While understanding an argument may depend on some a posteriori experience, one may still verify its premises a priori. So that's the idea: is there a path through reason that allows us to verify these premises, even if we need experience to grasp the premises, even if we can also verify the premises by experience. And by experience here, I just mean empirical experiences, not the experience of reason. All right, so we can build on this logical leg. So the logical leg goes from there's no truth to there is a truth. Now we can give a conceptualist path that builds on that. So from truth to mind, suppose there's no God, then it is true that there is no God. Therefore, if there is no God, then there is a truth, namely that there is no God. Necessarily, if there is a truth, then there is a necessary truth. For example, that truth entails existence. Again, you might be able to verify this just by a principle of reason. You see by reason that in order for there to be any truth, then you can see by reason that there would be all sorts of other truths, including necessary truths. And I bolded this next one because this is the key premise for the conceptualist. Necessarily, if there's a necessary truth, then there is a necessary mind. I'm going to say more in support of that in a moment. But if that's true, then it will follow that there's a God on the definition of God as a necessary mind. Okay, so how do we go from necessary truth to a necessary mind? Let me unpack this a little bit. 5.1, if P is necessarily true, then necessarily P is necessarily true. You might think of this as an interpretation of S4 logic, where the necessity property or operator is itself necessary. So if 2 + 2 = 4 is necessary, then it's necessary that 2 + 2 = 4 is necessary. 5.2, necessarily something cannot be true unless it exists. Therefore, if P is necessarily true, then necessarily P exists. And by the way, this is a abridged version of an article that I have called From Necessary Truth to Necessary Existence. So there's a lot of technical details behind the scenes, but I'm trying to just kind of give the overview feeling of the argument here. 5.4, I bolded this because this is the conceptualist premise. Necessarily, if a truth bearer exists, then that truth bearer depends on some mind. Now, let me be careful here to distinguish between the truth bearer and a truth maker. So think of, for example, my socks are on the floor. Okay. That maybe is made true by some socks out there, but there's something in addition to the socks, which is the truth bearer itself, the thing that is true, that my socks are on the floor. Okay. Now my socks aren't actually on the floor. So it turns out that there's no truth maker there, but there is the truth bearer. The truth bearer in this case happens to be false, but there is the thing that my socks are on the floor. That thing is real. And you might think, well, what kind of a thing is that? How could that kind of a thing exist? Well, if you're a conceptualist, then you already have reason to think that things like that will be conceptual things dependent on a mind. Okay. Now my goal here isn't to say that everybody has to take this path. I'm showing how somebody who is a conceptualist might already have independent reason to take this path. And then you can connect this path with the logical leg to get a bolder conclusion that atheism entails a contradiction. So this is a controversial step, but I think it is dialectically valuable because after all, there are many atheists who are conceptualists. I know many atheists who are conceptualists. You don't have to believe in God to think that propositions depend on concepts, which in turn depend on a mind. You could have independent motivations for that. It's not that you have to appeal to theism to be a conceptualist in this sense. You can just appeal to general considerations of the nature of abstracta and concepts and minds. So if all that is right, then if truth bearers necessarily exist, then some mind necessarily exists. This would be a result from these premises, And this was the key premise that I bolded in the previous slide here. Necessarily, if there's necessary truth, there is necessary mind. And so therefore, it follows that there is no God entails that there is a necessary mind. Well, entails that there's a truth from which you can get truths about truths, including necessary truths. Then using conceptualism, that gives you a necessary mind, which is what I mean by God. Okay, so, maybe there's this path. Now, again, I'm not claiming that entailments have to be uncontroversial. Everything seems to be controversial in some respect, just that it's possible to see it by reason. And if you're a conceptualist, then you might be in a position to say, yes, this seems like something I see by reason. Therefore, I think there is a contradiction here. All right, one more path, just to illustrate the general strategy, the existence path. This is based on some of my recent work on cosmological arguments, and in particular, on the second part of a cosmological argument, which seeks to deduce or identify the nature of a necessary cause or foundation of things. So here again, we have the logical leg. Suppose there is no God, then it is true that there is no God. Necessarily, if it is true that there is no God, then something is true. So now we have the existence of something true. Now, if something is true, then something exists, right? So here we have, again, that premise that something can't be anything, let alone true, unless it's there to be something, right? So it exists. Again, I think it's really important to make sure you have in mind the difference between the truth bearer and the truth maker. A lot of people get stuck on this. They start thinking about the truth maker and they say, oh, no, something can be true, even if there's no reality there. It's like, well, okay, there might be no reality that makes it true, depending on your view of truth makers, but there's still at least the thing there that is true, the truth bearer. So if all this is right, then there's no God entails that something exists. And then we can plug in the something exists into a classic argument from contingency. And this was a new thought for me. I hadn't really seen this until I had worked through, as I was writing my book, How Reason Can Lead to God, and I was working on the chapter on God's relationship to reason, it occurred to me that the conclusion of the contingency argument seemed to be that God has a kind of necessity that allows God to anchor all necessary truths, including even logical truths, given a certain logical path that I give, which I'm going to give in just a moment. And then from there, I realized that, okay, well, then it seems like there's got to be some way to show that God's non-existence is not even a logical possibility. So at that time, I thought, well, maybe God's non-existence is not a logical possibility, but you can't see by reason that it's not a logical possibility. That's why you can't run an ontological argument, putting aside some of these sort of contemporary moves that have opened up some new paths. But maybe you can run a cosmological argument to show that somehow, even if we can't do it, you can show that God exists through reason alone. But then I realized, well, maybe we can do it through this particular logical step, this logical leg. So here's how we complete the argument. I'm going to go do this pretty quickly because I'm just trying to illustrate the general strategy. But here's a two-stage cosmological argument. First, something exists. This was from the previous argument. Necessarily, if something exists, then the fact that something exists has an explanation in terms of a necessarily existing portion of reality. Why think that? Well, there's different arguments for this. Here's a proposition, which I'm going to just call P, that can maybe help motivate this through reason, because of course the whole goal is to see if we can verify each step just by reason. So the premise is that whatever can, consistent with reason, sort of without contradicting any principle of reason, have an explanation, does have some explanation. And you might think that this itself is motivated just by reason, that we can explain things. Things are explained as far as they can be explained. And when you just think about explanation and you just think about things just call for an explanation. And the only way we're going to make an exception is if there just can't be a further explanation. Okay, so maybe we can use this principle. And if this is a principle of reason, then it's a very powerful principle. We might argue that contingent things can, consistent with reason, have an explanation. And this might be motivated by a kind of insight into an irrelevant difference between contingent things. So like if a turtle exists, but it's a contingent thing, it can fail to be, then it seems consistent with reason that turtle could have a further explanation. if you change the number of legs on the turtle or you transform it into a giraffe or something, you might think just by reason that difference just can't be a relevant difference. Like by reason, it's like if the turtle could be explained, then so could the giraffe be explained. And by the way, this notion of explain, I mean it in a minimal way. I don't even mean that the explanation has to be a deterministic explanation, just that it could provide some illumination or some light on the thing to be explained. And so you might think that contingent things are sort of in the same boat. So if any of them can be explained, then all of them could be explained, and that all of them together can be explained. Then to avoid circularity, an explanation of all of them together is going to be in terms of something that's not contingent, which then would have necessary existence. Since contingent things by definition lack necessary existence, an ultimate explanation of contingent things would have necessary existence. So that's a path that you might have from reason in support of that premise. Therefore, there is a necessarily existing portion of reality. I have a website, necessarybeing.com, that many people have taken this interactive survey to see if their beliefs already entail a necessarily existing portion of reality. Most people do. And that website might sort of verify the idea that it's by reason that people have a kind of insight into principles of explanation, or at least possible explanations that can then lead to this conclusion. Okay, well, how do we go from a necessary thing to a necessary mind? Here's a pathway that I've developed in my recent work. Necessarily and lacks arbitrary unexplained limits, where a limit, let's just say, is some non-maximal quantitative feature, like being able to create 10 turtles. So we might motivate this using P again. Whatever can, consistent with reason, have an explanation, has some explanation. Limits can, consistent with reason, have an explanation. And again, you might appeal to a kind of irrelevant difference. If having 5 legs can be explained and having 10 legs can be explained, this sort of difference in number of legs might just sort of strike your mind as irrelevant to an explanation, to the possibility of an explanation. Then you combine that with P and you get an actual explanation. 10, necessarily, if N lacks cognitive powers, then N has some arbitrary unexplained limit, maybe in its greatness or in its total causal power. There's a way of developing this argument. So you argue that N has at least some causal power or some greatness in order to be a foundation of all power, in order to be a cause of contingent things that have power, in order to provide some kind of explanation of contingent things that have power. It's got to have some measure of power itself. And if its power doesn't include cognitive powers, then there's a kind of limit in its degree of power. And you might think that that's an arbitrary, unexplained limit that by reason, there could be, at least consistent with reason, a further explanation. If that's right, then necessarily N has some cognitive powers. Therefore, it would follow that there is a necessary mind. Here, I'm thinking that a mind is required for there to be cognitive powers. Cognitive powers belong to a mind. So this is another pathway from there is no God to there is something, and then from there is something, plug that into a modal cosmological argument, and you get there is a God. Now, of course, each one of these steps can invite further scrutiny. Each one can be open to debate, but that there are these paths, and somebody might already have an independent reason to go down these paths, wholly apart from thinking about whether God's existence is logically necessary. So part of the goal of what I'm doing here is I'm showing how independent routes can be plugged in to this logical leg to deduce a more powerful conclusion than the conclusion you might have thought was possible to deduce. So here's a summary of the key idea of this modal argument. The idea is that a perfect maximally great nature is the only nature that one can see by reason to be unable to have a further explanation. It's because it's so great that it's ultimate. Any further explanation of it would itself be ultimate, but the greatest, most perfect thing would have to be the ultimate thing, and so would be the kind of thing that isn't able to be further explained just by reason. Lesser natures can, by contrast, consistent with reason, have a further explanation. Again, this might be motivated by sort of insight into irrelevant differences between these lesser natures. A maximal nature, a maximally great nature then, would include the great powers of a necessary mind. And so for this reason, the foundation of existence could only be a necessary mind. So again, if anything exists, then there is a necessary mind. So then the conclusion would be, therefore, there is no God entails that there is a God. All right, so, this is supposed to not be able to be done. But, maybe it can be done. There are these interesting paths to explore. I'm going to just conclude with a few take-home thoughts, and then it'll be fun to interact with you guys, see what you think. First, I just want to make sure that I disclaim here that these are like knockdown arguments. I think sometimes people associate pathways of reason with like clear proofs that are uncontroversial. It's almost like we have this idea that if it's an empirical argument, well, then it's maybe open to a kind of probabilistic inference. An argument from reason, well, then it has to be a conclusive proof. Nobody could doubt or debate, or it just doesn't work at all. Well, I don't think that. I think both truths of reason and truths through empirical experience can come in degrees of clarity. And I think they can also come in degrees of clarity relative to your own unique position of consideration. So something that's clear to me might not be clear to you. Something that's clear to you, that might not be clear to me. So I want to make sure that's clear, that what I'm doing here is not trying to show that there can't be rational disagreement about these paths. But second, I think these paths are very significant because these are paths that theists may already have reason to take. And I'm thinking now of theists who are skeptical of ontological arguments. Maybe you don't think any purely ontological argument works, or maybe you've got doubts about those. Or maybe you think some ontological argument does work, but you don't think there's any other path that can get you to a contradiction from atheism. But maybe you independently are a conceptualist, or maybe you independently like a kind of two-stage cosmological argument. Well, then what I've done here is I've extended those paths, I've connected them to the logical leg to get you a stronger conclusion. And there's a bonus result. If you take one of these paths, you get an opportunity to fill out your understanding of God's relationship to logic itself. So suppose God's existence is logically necessary. Then here's an idea. Here's an option for you. Maybe God's mind is a suitable home for other things that are logically necessary, including things that have the structure of a thought. For example, abstract propositions, they have the structure of a thought. And so you might think that all of these things could exist in the nature of God, in God's mind. There's different ways you might cash this out, but you might think that abstract propositions are, in a sense, grounded in the fabric of God's necessary mind. And I'm talking about logically necessary propositions. This account is available to you if God spans all the logically possible worlds. God's mind is there. It's available in all those logically possible worlds. Because I think sometimes what I've heard people say is that there are logical necessities where God doesn't exist. There's logical possibilities where God doesn't exist. If God is a metaphysically necessary being, that doesn't mean he spans all the logical possible worlds. And so they'll say that God's mind doesn't span enough worlds for God's mind to be a home for all the logical truths. But if any of these paths go through, then you can actually say that God's mind does span enough worlds to account for all of these things and ground all of these things. So while this account is not required, this option is a bonus opportunity for anyone inclined to take one of the paths. And then finally, I just want to kind of end on this note about reason itself, the power of reason. Don't underestimate the power of reason. I was thinking of reason as sort of like the internet. When the internet first came out, all you could do was search, and then you could do email, and that was it. And when you thought of the internet, you thought email and search. Then more things came out. People started to create YouTube. You could share videos. People started creating online companies, and on and on and on. So that the meaning of the word internet, in a way, has transitioned from what it meant, at least in my own mind, when it first came out. And I think something similar is going on with reasoning. I think in the beginning, there was a kind of association of reason with perhaps these sort of syntactical deductions and the sort of analytic truths. But then there's like more and more things, more and more paths that can be opened up. And so I say reason has great power to reveal many great things, and the limits of its power are uncharted. So I hope this talk can inspire you to explore some new paths of reason, perhaps even to a grand conclusion, something as grand as that the greatest possible being exists. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Rasmussen, for this rich presentation. And we have now some time for debate, so we are open to questions. And I think that Professor Persp has a question, and after Professor Agnaldo. So Professor Persp, please.
So as you know, I'm very fond of your arguments, and these are no exception. I do have a worry about the first one. And it seems, let's take my example of a necessary truth as 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, so now that 2 + 2 = 4 is necessarily true seems to me to be ambiguous between two different claims. The first claim is that necessarily it is the case that 2 + 2 = 4 is true. The second is, it is true that necessarily 2 + 2 = 4, right? And the second one necessarily functions as an operator, and the first one, well, actually in both it functions as an operator, but in one case it's within the scope of true and the other is outside the scope of truth. And now it seems to me that if you are attracted to a view on which truth bearers are contingent things, like sentence tokens and so on, then you will simply deny that there are any necessary truths in the first sense, in the sense where necessarily it is true, it is the case that it is true that 2 + 2 = 4. You'll just say, okay, here, it is true that necessarily 2 + 2 = 4. But it's the first one that's necessary to get, it's needed for the rest of your argument to work.
Yes, so this is a very important objection, and it's interesting and tricky because there are a lot of things underneath the surface here. As you know, it's interesting. I was talking with Richard Swinburne about this particular argument, and I filled it out in terms of S4 logic. So in a more careful presentation, I made the argument that necessarily, let's say 1 = 1, and then by S4, you get necessarily 1 = 1. And then I had this argument that something can't be necessary unless it's true. And so I went from the necessity operator to a truth operator, and then truth entails existence. And so you get, by substitution, necessarily something exists. And it was interesting because Richard's response there was to question S4. He said that this seems to perhaps reveal a counterexample to S4. At least that's what he said at that time. Now, he hadn't had a chance to sort of mull over the argument. He was visiting us to give a talk, and I sort of chased him down and gave him this argument to get his reaction. But his reaction does suggest to me that there is something about how you interpret logic that's in play here. So I think one way you can get out of this argument is by interpreting the S4 logic in a schematic way without thinking that the operator is expressing a property of a thing. So, necessarily 1 = 1, that's not translated as there is this thing 1 = 1 that has this property of being necessary. So there is that move. I mean, I've in my book, Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, I developed this argument, and I have a chapter on propositions where I talk about that very interpretation of the logic, and I make the argument that the best interpretation of the operator is that it's expressing a property of a thing. But then maybe on that interpretation, maybe you could have some reason to doubt S4 or reinterpret S4. So there are certainly some different moves here that one could make. But I do think there is an open path. I mean, you might just find S4 intuitive, and you might think the best interpretation of it is going to be in terms of expressing a real property. And then from there, you can deduce the result. Does that help, Alex?
Yeah.
At all?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that it's similar to actually denying S4 in a way, but not quite.
But not
So, I
quite,
mean,
depending
my
on how
move-
you interpret it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the operator move is compatible with having S4, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes. And so then it comes down to how you understand those operators. Now I'm stretching my memory. I've got this article on the correspondence theory of truth where I also developed this, and I think it's in there. No, it might, no. It might be in my article From Necessary Truth to Necessary Existence. It might be in there where I talk about our use of language. Like if you say that it's true, well, what is the it referring to? Now, there's different ways of understanding this. If you say, John believes some things that are true, well, are there things there that he believes? John believes some things that are necessary. So I make an argument there from our use of language that when you say that it is true or it is necessary, there's an it there. There's something there that has truth. And that's actually how we would understand the operator. Necessarily, it is necessarily 1 + 1 = true. No, necessarily 1 = 1, necessarily 1 + 1 = 2. Those could be understood in terms of expressing a property of necessity that applies to a truth bearer. Then leaving open, because one of the points you're making here is, well, what if the truth bearer is a sentence token? Then there has to be a limit to where this argument can go. Well, maybe what it is that you start neutrally. You say, well, I'm going to leave open, maybe it is a truth bearer. And then you discover through the argument that it couldn't be, maybe it is a concrete sentence token, but then you discover through the argument that the concrete sentence token can't be the right kind of item that can play this role of truth bearer, given this reflection on this analysis of these operators.
Can I make a suggestion here? It seems to me that, I mean, I think sentence tokens are truth bearers, and I think you think so too. You just don't think they are like ultimate or fundamental truth bearers. And that suggests there may be a gap in your argument as formulated here, because here you have simply assumed, let's take this truth bearer, I'll prove it's a necessary being. But you don't actually believe that. You don't actually believe that every truth bearer is a necessary being. So it's an interesting question. Where in your argument then you use the ultimacy of the truth bearer?
I think that's a great question. So my sense is that the ultimacy of the truth bearer comes into the interpretation of the modal operators that is required to make this inference in, let's see, in number 4. No, in number 3. There's no truth. It's true that there's no. Let's see. No, let's come down here. Maybe it's 5.2.
No, I think the like for the non-ultimate token truth bearers, I think 5.2 is still going to be true, right? So like my sentence, it's necessarily true that a sentence token cannot be true unless it exists. That much is fine. I think it's going to be at 5.3 because the sentence token, you might say, is when the arithmetician says 2 + 2 = 4, their sentence token is necessarily true, but doesn't exist necessarily.
Yes, or it's the interpretation of 5.1 that allows you to deduce 5.3.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's it. It's going to be in 5.1, and 5.1 is a kind of a condensed version of the argument in my article From Necessary Truth to Necessary Existence.
Okay, I should shut up. There are more questions from other people.
Well, that's helpful. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Professor Agnaldo Portugal.
Hello.
Hi, Josh. It's very nice to see you again.
It's wonderful to see you again.
Yeah, I hope we can see in person. another day. It is
I look forward to that.
kind of means doesn't prevent us to see each other in person again one day. But thank you for your talk. I have two questions, a very simple one, probably. Simple ones. The first one is that you're arguing from the idea that God is a necessary mind, but that's compatible with the God of deism as well.
Yes.
And how do you go from God as a necessary mind to the God of theism?
Okay, so
That's
it's
the
not
first
it's not
one.
enough. So you want me to do so much here. So it's not enough to show there's a contradiction and saying there's no necessary mind. I've got to get all the attributes. I don't know. I mean, maybe that path from perfection can get you more, right? Because here, let's jump down to there. The second stage of the modal cosmological argument. You guys are still able to see this screen. Is that correct? Just making sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you might think that anything less than the absolutely perfect being would have a nature that could, consistent with reason, have a further explanation.
I see. That could be part of a cumulative argument.
Yeah. I mean, I try to be modest, you know, I want to give people sort of the freedom to take these paths, not say too much, but here we do have a reasoning that maybe can give you more, maybe can even get you what you would hope for.
Right. The second one is there a difference between implicit contradiction and incoherence? Because people say that incoherence is the kind of when you have a contradiction that's not it becomes clearer. Is that what you mean by implicit contradiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of terminology, but when people use the term incoherence, sometimes what I think they mean there is that there is some kind of contradiction, whether they can see it or not in their own minds. I kind of don't like that term incoherence. It feels too harsh. It's like saying, oh, your belief is incoherent. It's like, well, I mean, you know, is it incoherent to think that Goldbach's conjecture is not true? You know, well, you might not really be able to see that implicit contradiction at all. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of terminology.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Professor Itala D'Ottaviano. We do not hear you, Professor.
Maybe you could think contradictions as special kinds of incoherence. Don't you think?
Yes.
Some strict kinds of incoherence.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, it will come down to definition. I mean, if you think of a contradiction, I'm thinking of a contradiction as, again, something that can be shown by reason to entail something of a form A and not A, through seeing principles of reason. So that's how I'm thinking about that. If you think of an incoherence as that, well, then it's just the same thing. I guess maybe when I think about it, this is just my own use of words. The term coherent, incoherent kind of reminds me of somebody's mental state. So like your mental state is coherent or your mental state is incoherent. Whereas when I think about whether a proposition, which maybe depends on a mental state, I guess it could be a mental state depending on your view of it, whether it entails a contradiction, I'm thinking of that maybe in a way that feels more neutral to me. Just like where do these links of entailment lead? Sort of whether it's in somebody's mind or not. So not sure if that's helpful or not, but that's how I tend to think about it.
Okay, there is a next question by Professor Fabio Bertato. I will read it.
Okay.
It seems that in your reply to the existential worry, it can be considered a problem between object language and meta language. However, if one considers in an object language that there is no truth, we gain an infinity of meta truths. Namely, it is true that there is no truth It is true that it is true that there is no truth, etc. Thus, of a negative existential entails infinite meta-positive existential. What do you think about this?
This is a very powerful question, and it's also a difficult question for me because my own view about propositions is in flux. Ever since I came across this paradox of propositions. So actually, Alex and I, we've written on this kind of a thing. We have an article called The Problem of Plurals, and we talk about referring to the plurals of everything. Well, propositions are kind of like referring things, and so they can refer to like anything and even themselves. And so you can get these weird paradoxes where you have the proposition that refers to all things other than itself. Does that proposition refer to itself or not? And there's ways of setting this up that leads to deep problems. And the more, and I mean, honestly, I've been thinking about this for the last 5 or 10 years, especially in the last 5 years, just thinking about, okay, what do I do with this? And ultimately, it's led me to rethink my view of propositions. And currently, I'm thinking that propositions don't automatically exist. And I'm toying with the idea that propositions do depend on mental activity. Now, if there are necessary propositions, maybe they depend on necessary mental activity in God's mind, but there's still an order to things. So God doesn't sort of in one mental act think all the propositions, including all the ones about that very mental act, etc. To avoid a kind of self-reference problem, God might think sort of first order propositions and the next order propositions. Okay, so I'm circling to your question. Your question is a very powerful question because if you think of propositions as sort of automatically existing, they're all there, then yes, for any proposition P, if P exists, then there also exists the proposition that P is true. And then the proposition that P is true entails that there exists the proposition that is true that P is true, and so on and so on and so on. So I was mindful of this when I was setting up this presentation, and I was thinking about how I could do this in a minimal way so that I can still make my argument that for any proposition P and P, for any proposition P will entail the proposition that P is true. And the conclusion I came to is that, well, maybe what I can do is I can understand this in terms of existing propositions. So as long as the propositions exist, then you can see by reason an entailment link between them. And we can leave open whether that entailment link sort of requires that they exist. Okay, let me see if I can just try. I think this is really important. Let me see if you could just spare me just a little longer on this. Let's take the proposition that 1 equals 1. And then take the proposition that it is true that 1 equals 1. Now, what I claim is that once I get those propositions in my mind, 1 equals 1, and it is true that 1 equals 1, I can see an entailment link between them. I just see this. I see that the one entails the other. Okay. But now there's this further question about whether, if there's that entailment link from the one to the other, that therefore that's going to have to imply that they both automatically exist. I want to say the necessary truths have a necessary existence, but that you can see the entailment without getting to the existential import. Yeah, go ahead. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, I thought maybe you were going to add to that, but so this is a difficult question because I'm still thinking about what the minimal requirements are for this argument. I mean, it might be simple just to say, well, yeah, I mean, P entails P is true, entails P is true, et cetera, et cetera. But, what are the minimal metaphysical requirements for that entailment so that you can still deduce the entailments? So that's where I'm at on that, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so if there is no further, oh, sorry, Giselle, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much, Dr. Josh Rasmussen. That was really inspiring to me. And I'd like to ask you two related questions, not so related, but the first is the second strategy involving existence is not so convincing as the first, at least in my opinion. Why don't you use some Bayesian reasoning instead of a modal logical argument? I mean, this would be enough maybe to establish some weaker premises and some more modest conclusions, but weaker premises that you shouldn't, and then you shouldn't have to maintain two correlated arguments for the premise 5 of your argument if you had some more probabilistic reasoning. Why did you choose to hold a logical strictly argument? And the second one, this is the first question, and the second one is, it remembers me it's quite like, not the same, but it smells like the Plantingian argument against naturalism, where he it's an epistemic argument. Yours is logical, a logical one, but assuming naturalism and evolution, you acquire a defeater for naturalism. Plantinga then hold that there's a defeater, but you didn't suggest something to atheism as well. I would like to hear from you what you think atheists should do if your argument is correct. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Those are great questions. Well, of course, one difference is that Plantinga's argument doesn't deduce a contradiction. It just deduces a kind of uncomfortable epistemic defeating of one's faculties, or an undercutting defeater. As for what an atheist should do in response to my argument, well, certainly they've got some different options. I mean, one thing they could do is just not take the paths, right? Deny the premises. Maybe they don't accept the conceptualist premise, or maybe they don't accept the principle of explanation. But then this leads to your first question, which is, why not give a more modest version of the argument? In particular, I could appeal to probability or Bayesian probability. And I appreciate that a lot. In fact, actually, I wrote this presentation out as an article, which I've submitted to a journal. And in that article, I actually give the explanation path in terms of a more modest form, so that it's, well, I say normally facts of this type are going to have an explanation. And so one could see by reason a kind of probabilistic support. And then this could give one a reason to think that atheism, well, let's see, that would that be an entailment? See, I guess that's where no, because I wanted sort of a modest, I'd have to think about this a little bit, because on one level, you could say that I have got some probabilistic reason for thinking that there's an entailment. On another level, I could say, no, there actually isn't an entailment there, but there's just a probabilistic link. And so what I want to show is not just there's a probabilistic link, but that there actually is an entailment. But maybe what your suggestion does is it invites me to consider probabilistic evidence for the entailment itself. So that's a nice point. I appreciate that.
Yes. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so in order to finish, Professor Aitala has another question.
Joshua, first of all, many thanks for the very interesting talk. I would like to know if you see any relevant relation between your argument and Leibniz proof, the ontological Leibniz proof of the existence of God, and also any relation between your argument and Gödel's proof, because Gödel at the beginning claimed that his proof was independent of any particular logical system. But when Dana Scott presented his version of Gödel's proof, it was introduced by using, I'm not sure if S4 or S5 model system. And both Leibniz and Gödel finished proving that God is a necessary being, and so he must exist. What do you think? Because you are using the necessity of truth, God as a necessary being.
Yes, this is a very nice question. Yeah, thank you. So Leibniz has an ontological path and a cosmological argument path.
Yes, yes.
Gödel has an ontological argument path. I'm thinking of the paths that I'm pointing to as ways of hooking up arguments that aren't ontological arguments to this kind of logical leg to deduce a contradiction. So like, for example, in Gödel's argument, one version of it has to do with deducing from positive properties like negative properties or non-positive properties. Yes. And I'm taking this as being sort of a path through the concept or the nature of God. So you're thinking of God as this perfect being, and because he's so perfect, his perfection can't entail negative properties. But then given modal logic, if it doesn't entail negative properties, it has to be possible. And then you can plug in a kind of S5 argument to go from the possible perfection to the actual perfection. So there are these overlaps, but still the ontological argument is kind of starting with the concept of God and deducing from that concept, like applying reason to that concept to get this a priori path. Whereas I'm thinking of my argument as not so much like trying to show from the concept of God that that concept applies to reality, but rather actually getting into reality through just through truth itself. Like, so, because it's, maybe we could summarize it like this. All these arguments have to get to reality somehow. You know, if you're going to argue from reason, you got to get to reality somehow. How are we going to get to reality? Well, the ontological arguments, Gödel's argument and other ones seem to go through thinking about the nature of the concept of God. Whereas I'm trying to get to reality, not through that, but rather just thinking about what it means to say that it's true that no God exists. And I'm thinking, well, if it's true that no God exists, that's enough to get us to reality, because then we have the reality that something's true. So therefore something exists. Okay, now we've moved ourselves into existence. Now we use reason to deduce that God exists using one of these other classical lines from contingency or from the conceptualist. So, I mean, ultimately all these lines are related in some respects, right? But as far as the big difference that I'm seeing, it kind of has to do with like, how do you go from reason to reality? That's, I think, kind of the big obstacle. I mean, I think that's even why people would resist all pathways from reason, is they say, in principle, you can't go from reason to reality. And the ontological paths go from the concept of God to reality, whereas the paths I'm pointing to go from the concept of truth to reality. And so that's a different kind of strategy.
Yes, I agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we should end in order to have a break, but I will just read a comment by Professor Persp if you want to briefly comment on it. He gives a suggestion: instead of using S4, use what one might call ultra-weak S4. So there is at least one P such that necessarily P. So ultra-weak S4 is uncontroversial and holds in any model logic with necessitation and at least one theorem.
I appreciate that.
Do you want to comment on it?
Yes, and then I think that will help us to tease out the sort of substantial metaphysical interpretation or implication of S4. And so, yeah, I appreciate that. That's a helpful point. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, so let us thank you again, our speaker. Thank you very much for this stimulating talk.
Thank you.
We will have a break and we will come back in about 40 minutes for the last session of the event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. See you.
Thank you.
I'll stop the live streaming, right? And we are not. Okay, and we are going to send the next link. We have sent it sent already, but
Let me put it again
okay.
in the chat. I think it's easier this.